Clint Eastwood has never needed to raise his voice to make someone feel small, and that quality alone sets him apart from nearly every other figure American cinema has produced. 6 decades of directing and acting built something in him that most people in Hollywood never develop, a philosophy so stripped of excess that it sounds almost too simple to be real. Show up ready, deliver honestly, trust the moment, and move on. No indulgence, no negotiation, no second chances. Cross that code once, waste his time, disrespect his process, or mistake his patience for permission, and he won't argue with you, won't send a message through channels, won't make a scene. He'll just never call you again. For a man who has directed over 40 motion pictures and shared the screen with virtually every major talent the entertainment industry has ever produced, that quiet finality carries more weight than any public confrontation ever could. What follows are 5 performers who received exactly that verdict. 5 names quietly removed from consideration for every film project Eastwood has touched since their one and only collaboration. Their stories aren't merely Hollywood biography. They open a window into the mind of a filmmaker who has never confused repetition with excellence or busyness with purpose, and who built one of the most distinctive careers in American film history by protecting both of those distinctions with everything he had. Richard Burton lands at number 5, and for anyone familiar with Eastwood's biography, the name carries a particular weight. The two shared the screen in the 1968 war film Where Eagles Dare, a production that went on to become a genuine classic of the action genre, which makes it all the more striking that the experience left Eastwood with a contempt for Burton that never fully dissolved. Burton ranked among the most gifted actors of his generation by almost any measure, his classical training impeccable, his range enormous, his voice capable of filling a room without effort. Talent and discipline, though, are entirely different things, and on that set, the gap between them widened each morning. Burton was deep in the turbulence of his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor at the time, and the disorder of his personal life arrived on set with him, or rather, arrived late with him, since punctuality wasn't something the production could count on. Camera operators who worked on Where Eagles Dare recalled Eastwood standing quietly in position, prepared and word-perfect, watching Burton struggle through lines that Clint had memorized before the crew had finished setting up. The contempt that formed wasn't theatrical or loud. It was the specific kind that develops when a disciplined man watches someone squander what they've been given, and it hardened fast. A pivotal exposition scene reportedly required more than 20 takes to complete, and by the 10th, Eastwood had stepped away from the set entirely to watch from a distance. When a crew member asked whether he was bothered, the answer came without emotion. "I'm getting paid by the picture, not by the hour." None of that mattered quite as much, though, as what Burton said when he didn't think it would travel. Referring to Where Eagles Dare as just a paycheck, within earshot of people who had invested genuine effort in it, crossed a line that preparation problems alone would never have reached. Eastwood has always treated every genre, war film, western, drama, biography, with identical seriousness, and casual dismissal of the work itself registered as something close to an insult against the craft. Years later, asked directly about Burton, Eastwood produced 3 words: talented guy, wasted talent. In his private language, that's not an elegy, that's a closed door. Jean Seberg holds the 4th position, and her story carries complications that make it unlike any other entry on this list. By 1968, when she and Eastwood co-starred in the musical Paint Your Wagon, Seberg had already become the target of an FBI surveillance campaign tied to her political activism, a sustained persecution that would contribute to her psychological decline and eventually to her death in 1979. None of that history was visible to the crew at the time, and Eastwood, a man who responds to what's in front of him rather than to what might be behind it, could only work with what he saw. What he saw frustrated him at a level the production struggled to contain. Paint Your Wagon already represented uncomfortable territory for Eastwood, a large-budget musical requiring him to sing on camera, a departure so far from his established screen presence that he threw himself into preparation with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything. Seberg, by contrast, appeared to be somewhere else entirely, arriving late, drifting through rehearsals, struggling with choreography that Eastwood had absorbed without complaint. A choreographer on the production described the contrast without ambiguity. Eastwood drilling through sequences with focused purpose, while Seberg moved through the same material as though the film were happening to someone in a nearby room. Their romantic scenes together became the point where tension hardened into something more durable. Seberg would stop mid-take to question the script, to probe her character's motivation, to suggest alternatives to lines that had already been committed to a production schedule. 5 interruptions into a scene that required them simply to walk together and exchange dialogue, Eastwood walked off set without a word, returned 10 minutes later and said, "Let's just get this done." People who witnessed it noted that this was approximately as close to an outburst as he ever allowed himself publicly. When Paint Your Wagon underperformed, Seberg gave interviews suggesting that Eastwood's limited musical ability had contributed to the film's failure and that public criticism was the last thing required. He never spoke against her publicly, especially not after her death, but a longtime friend noted that he would change the subject whenever the film or her name came up. His private summary was exactly what you'd expect from him. "Some people aren't cut out for the work. It's not their fault, but it's not something I need to deal with twice." Tommy Lee Jones represents something different from the first 2 entries, not an actor whose personal difficulties spilled onto the set, but one whose professional instincts collided with Eastwood's at a frequency that goodwill alone couldn't fix. The two worked together on Wolfgang Petersen's 1993 thriller In the Line of Fire, a production that performed well with both audiences and critics, which makes the private fallout from it easy to overlook. Both men carry natural authority on camera. Both command attention without appearing to try. On paper, the pairing suggested something with real charge to it, and that's precisely where the problem lived, because 2 actors who instinctively pull focus toward themselves don't automatically create harmony. They create competition. Crew members present during filming recalled that Jones had a tendency to dominate scenes in ways that conflicted with the collaborative dynamic Eastwood insists upon, a dynamic built entirely on genuine listening, on actors responding to each other rather than positioning themselves within the frame. The confrontational scenes between their characters pushed this tension further, and what made it worse was what happened after Petersen called cut. Jones would hold his character's hostile energy between takes, maintaining the scene's emotional temperature rather than releasing it when the cameras stopped. Eastwood, who makes a clean and deliberate separation between performance and reality, experienced this as something more than a stylistic difference. A sound technician present for one such moment recalled Eastwood watching Jones hold his gaze after the cut, then turning and walking away, muttering to a nearby assistant, "Life's too short for that." A disagreement over the interpretation of a key confrontation scene finished things off. Jones continued pushing his preferred reading across multiple takes, which directly contradicted everything Eastwood believed about committing to a choice and trusting it. When casting directors raised Jones's name for subsequent film projects, Eastwood would shake his head and say, "Let's look at other options." Years later, pressed about potential collaboration, his answer landed with polite, complete finality. "Tommy's got his way of working. I've got mine. Sometimes different approaches should stay different." Leonardo DiCaprio arriving at number 2 might be the most revealing entry on the entire list because DiCaprio is not someone who lacks commitment. His preparation is well documented across a career built on biographical drama, period film, and character study. His track record stands on its own. The friction on the set of the 2011 biographical film J. Edgar had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with philosophy. DiCaprio arrived with extensive research, psychological analysis, historical documentation, and a depth of intellectual engagement that most directors in American cinema would have welcomed without hesitation. Eastwood found it exhausting. A script supervisor who worked on the production described the dynamic as two people attempting to communicate fluently in languages with completely different grammars. DiCaprio wanting to discuss motivation, emotional architecture, historical context, and Eastwood wanting him to deliver the lines naturally and trust what happened when he did. The scene that crystallized everything was an emotionally demanding breakdown sequence. By all accounts, DiCaprio delivered on the first take, genuinely, with the kind of spontaneous authenticity that Eastwood has built his entire directing career around capturing. DiCaprio then asked for another take and another, and by the sixth, Eastwood had walked away from the monitor entirely and stood at the craft services table drinking coffee, simply waiting for it to be over. What Eastwood read into those additional takes wasn't dedication. It was distrust. Distrust of the director's eye. Distrust of the captured moment. Distrust of the instinct that his whole philosophy depends on honoring. When J. Edgar rapped, a producer associated with the film remembered Eastwood exhaling with the kind of exhaustion that sits below the physical layer. His words were, "Some people want to climb the mountain. Others want to analyze the mountain, measure the mountain, write poems about the mountain. I just want to get to the top and enjoy the view." Every subsequent casting conversation excluded DiCaprio's name without drama or explanation. 4 words handled it when the subject came up. Great actor, not for me. Barbra Streisand sits at the top of this list under a circumstance that makes it singular among all 5 names. They never worked together. No shared set, no clash over a scene, no words exchanged on a production. Their conflict exists entirely on the level of artistic philosophy, which may be exactly why it runs so deep. The animosity took shape in the early 1980s as both were establishing themselves as actor-directors with opposing convictions about what that role demands. Stories circulated about Streisand's directing process. 50 takes of a simple walking shot, days consumed deliberating over a single camera angle, weeks spent on questions that other filmmakers resolved in minutes. To Eastwood, none of that registered as perfectionism. A producer who had worked with both separately put it plainly. Eastwood didn't see a different approach to film directing when he heard those accounts. He saw an offense against what the work is supposed to be. The philosophical divide surfaced during the 1992 awards season, when Streisand had been overlooked for a Best Director nomination despite The Prince of Tides receiving multiple Academy Awards nominations elsewhere, and the conversation around gender bias in the entertainment industry was legitimate and long overdue. Eastwood, privately, framed the issue through craft rather than through any other lens, suggesting that directorial decisions had driven the outcome. Whether that reading was accurate or not, it reveals something consistent in how he processes every conflict, entirely through the work, with everything else stripped away. Streisand reportedly responded by questioning whether his efficiency came at the cost of emotional depth, and that landed where it was always going to land hardest, because it challenged the core premise of everything Eastwood had built across his career as a director. The strangest chapter of this rivalry arrived through the bridges of Madison County in 1995. Streisand had previously been attached to both direct and star in the adaptation of the best-selling novel before ultimately stepping away. Eastwood took over both roles and immediately stripped the material down, removing backstory, eliminating secondary characters, dismantling the elaborate structure that had been envisioned before him. The resulting drama earned Meryl Streep an Academy Award nomination and wide critical recognition, and to everyone who understood the subtext, Eastwood had made his entire argument without a single word of debate. He had simply made the film and let the outcome speak. A longtime collaborator summarized Streisand's position at the top of this list without overcomplicating it. Eastwood can work alongside people he disagrees with provided they share his work ethic. What he cannot tolerate is someone who turns the act of creation into self-indulgence, because in his private worldview, overthinking isn't a virtue, it's a failure of nerve. Taken together, these 5 names function as a kind of artistic autobiography, a record of the values Eastwood has defended throughout his film career, not through declarations or interviews, but through the quiet and permanent closing of doors. Morgan Freeman, who has worked with Eastwood across several films and maintained one of the most enduring actor-director relationships in American entertainment, offered the most precise summary of what connects all 5 conflicts. Eastwood believes in the power of instinct, Freeman said, and when someone approaches filmmaking from the opposite direction, he doesn't simply disagree with their method. He sees it as genuinely harmful to the work itself. That distinction between disagreement and harm is what separates his private judgments from mere preference. Hilary Swank, who won an Academy Award under his direction for $1 Million Baby, described what it feels like to work within his philosophy. When you know you have 1 or 2 takes, you come alive differently. You're present in a way that's hard to maintain across 20 attempts. Gene Hackman, who worked with Eastwood on Unforgiven before stepping away from acting, put the expectation plainly. Show up prepared, deliver honestly, trust that he'll capture what matters, and the experience will be everything you hoped for. Fail any part of that, and both of you will be better off never repeating it. 6 decades of American cinema, 40 films, and a list of 5 names. That's Clint Eastwood's entire argument for how the work should be done, stated without a word.